Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Today you are here with me, Iman Mustafa, together with my team members, which is Sharif Hidayatullah, Nur Fakhri Razuki, Shazmil Arif, and also Muhammad Muayyad, in presenting about our research studies. Our research entitled The Economic Determinant Factors on Recession, case study on United States of America from 2008 to 2009. Back in late 2007, there have been a major events that shocked and affecting globally that were based on United States of America. It is the Great Recession that were caused by deregulation in the financial industry, where banks demanded more mortgage to support the profitable sale of derivative. It has created financial crisis in America and housing market bubbles because of the collapse in subprime mortgage market. And also the stock market were back in red because of the excessive loan effects. The main problem is the volume of credit extended by banks. The banks, they selfishly lend more than they should, and thus affecting the financial system soundness. The risks that the bank have taken have invited the market bubble, and it's just growing worse from there. The research question would be, is there any relationship between the high numbers of investors in the housing market bubbles, and were the bankers made the right decision by allowing such a requirement to be lended to investors easily? This is the question. For the research objective, our research objective is to investigate the relationship between the independent variables and the Great Recession. The independent variables that we use is housing market, labor market, import and export, currency, and also policy change. All of our studies were based on United States of America, where all the troubles, where all the things happen.
On to Chapter 2, Literature Review. This chapter will be reviewed the previous studies in order to provide better understanding and further information about six independent variables, which are housing market, labor market, import and export, currency, and policy change. Firstly is the housing market. This crisis was caused by risky lending practices in the form of subprime mortgage given to people with bad credit. When these borrowers were unable to refinance their loans, the subprime mortgage soared and lenders failed, resulting in a financial crisis in the US housing market, known as the subprime crisis in 2008. Secondly is the labor market. Research on the Great Recession has confirmed that across demographic groups, the decline in labor market outcomes since 2007 has been worse than any other recession in the post-war period. Thirdly is most import and export prices have dropped, with the majority of the points falling below the 45-degree line. This means that trade prices and volumes have been moving in the same direction in the current recession. Fourthly is currency. Poor performance in United States economic measures such as GDP tended to cause the dollar to decrease prior to the 2008 financial crisis. A study also said that depreciation in US dollar is a cycle that will happen and happen again in the future. Lastly is policy change. The traditional tool of monetary policy was quickly exhausted as the target for the benchmark federal funds rate was reduced between 0 and 0.25%. The Federal Reserve moved on to implement a radical range of new policy actions involving direct participation in markets for private securities. The Congress also approved a multi-year fiscal stimulus program that amounts to about 2% of GDP in 2009 and 2010 before tailing off in later years. That's all.
Okay, as for research methodology, research could also be either exploratory, descriptive, hypothesis testing, or case study analysis. This research is employing a hypothesis testing analysis. The aim of this study is to look at the social consequences of the Great Recession of 2018 to 2019. In all front of the Great Recession had a serious adverse impact and morphed into a global social crisis. The situation is made worse due to obsession with fiscal consolidation in the midst of tepid and uncertain recovery. The analysis will use secondary information, which is from secondary sources. Secondary sources are record of study using primary data to solve research problem and gather information through Bureau of Economic Analysis, United States Bureau of Labor Statistics and Economic Research, Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. All the data were from official site, and when some nations on websites that are used the official site as their guidance. For the independent variable is a variable that influences the dependent variable either in positive or negative way. The independent variable for this study are recession. When recession occurs, it will give a negative impact to the US economic growth. It can clarify how the situation of United States and how bad it can be, since there will be different of policy and need to regulate to overcome the recession. As for dependent variable is a variable that was influenced by the independent variable either in positive or negative way. The dependent variable for this study is housing market, labor market, currency, import and export, and lastly, policy change. To summarize this chapter, discuss the sample and the data gathered in order to suit the template for this analysis. It also provides the analyzed theoretical framework and research strategy, which explain the study's core mechanism. Aside from that, Chapter 3 describes the study premise as well as the study methodology, which comprise descriptive analysis, correlative analysis, regression analysis, and tests on assumption. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, chapter 4 would be research analysis, and this chapter objective is to describe the findings of the statistical analysis performed on the obtained data. In this chapter also, researcher will explain and address the hypothesis that is supported by the empirical results of all the experiments that have been conducted and assessed after various investigation on the data have been conducted. To assess the association between independent factors such as inflation rate and dependent variables such as currency, import-export, labor market, housing, and policy change. Tests are run using eView software, and the method used in this research are descriptive, correlation and regression analysis, and tests on assumption such as F-test, T-test, heteroscedasticity, and multicollinearity. For the descriptive analysis, is a statistical method and type of analysis that help describe, shows, and summarize data in a constructive way. For the research, there are a total of 8 observations. The data include samples selected of the dependent and independent variables from the year of 2008 until 2009. After all the data have been obtained, variables that have highest mean and median in units of hundreds for the research is currency with the value of 93.52539 and 93.34947. For the correlation analysis, is used to determine the recession index between all the variables, which are currency, export, housing, import, labor market, and policy change. Move on to the multicollinearity. The multicollinearity test is used to assess the multicollinearity or intercorrelation between independent variables. Correlation value of 0.8 depicts a perfect multicollinearity and should be removed from the model if possible. For a correlation value of less than 0.8 implies that the independent variable have weak or no correlation. Okay, for the regression analysis, evaluation of regression is used to evaluate the relationship between more than two variables and to decide whether independent variables explain the dependent variable effect. Through analyzing the econometrics formula, the results obtained can be explained. Based on the equation that has been generated, the independent variable, currency, export, import and housing show a negative correlation with recession, while independent variable, labor market and policy change show positive correlation. The F statistic value is 42.63952 based on the table 4.3, and the F statistic P value is 0.079363. The null hypothesis must therefore be rejected because the value has a high significant level of less than 5%. This means that in assessing the effects of the recession, at least one of the variable is useful.
This chapter will wrap up the analysis and provide recommendation for future research based on the data summary received from the project. This chapter is broken down into three parts. First, the most important findings will be summarized, and then the second, the limitation of this study will be discussed, and the last portion is researchers provide a few recommendations based on the findings. For the finding on major discussion, the crisis was the worst United States economic disaster. There are many things that been affected, especially in terms of currency, import, export, policy change, labour market and the housing market. And because of this, it threatened to destabilize the international financial system, and we will see a number of failed major investment and commercial banks, savings and loan association. It took an eternity to recover from the financial crisis. And we can see millions of families who had lost their homes, business and jobs, faced long-term unemployment and fallen into poverty battle for years. Their situation was diametrically opposed to that of the bankers who had contributed in the crisis beginning. Okay, so the conclusion, the United States has been gripped by the financial crisis in many ways, including financial and personal well-being. Given the economic harm that the United States has endured in the aftermath of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, and it makes sense. And then the higher unemployment, decreased salary and incomes, and lost all opportunity, all consequences of recession, and these are likely to suffer the consequences for a long-lasting period. This study was conducted to investigate how significantly recession affect the economic status in United States with the dependent variable of recession index. And we recommend that a wider scope of future study will help to get better outcome, and we can see on the recession effects for the other countries around the globe. For example, comparative analysis between effects of recession in the United States and effects of recession in Malaysia to look on which has the better effects and action towards the unprecedented circumstances. In summary, this chapter describes the findings of the inquiry, and in addition, this chapter makes advice to researchers on how to gather information for future study. And lastly, the result is the researchers will have a better knowledge of this problem. Okay, that's all from us. Thank you.